Before the first pulse of existence, there was only the void. It was not merely an absence of light, but a physical weight that pressed against the edges of nowhere. No horizon existed to mark a boundary. No sound echoed, for there was nothing to vibrate against. The deep was a vast, formless expanse, stretching into an infinite, hollow silence. It held no temperature, no texture, and no movement. Time itself had no anchor here, drifting in a stillness that felt eternal. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, velvet pressure that filled every conceivable space. Yet, within this stillness, the air held a strange, static charge, as if the silence were waiting for a command. It was a state of total suspension, where the potential for everything remained locked behind a wall of nothingness. The void did not shift. It did not breathe. It simply was. It was the canvas of the unmade, waiting for the first stroke of intent to shatter the equilibrium. The silence deepened, becoming so profound that it felt like a physical barrier. In this crushing, silent dark, the stillness was absolute, waiting for the first spark to ignite the deep. A subtle shift occurred within the absolute stillness. It began not as a sound, but as a slow, rhythmic disturbance rippling across the surface of the deep. The formless expanse, once perfectly flat and unresponsive, began to yield. Something moved across the face of the waters. It was a presence, invisible yet undeniable, carving a path through the heavy, stagnant dark. Where it passed, the liquid depths stirred, creating faint, concentric waves that traveled outward into the nothingness. The water responded to this unseen influence, rising and falling in a gentle, rolling motion that broke the monotony of the void. This movement was deliberate, a slow, sweeping glide that felt like a breath drawn in preparation for a great exertion. The deep, previously frozen in its isolation, now possessed a sense of direction. The ripples grew, catching the weight of the dark and pushing it aside. Every movement was a subtle test of the boundaries. The atmosphere thickened with the intensity of this motion, turning the static void into a field of kinetic potential. The rhythm accelerated. The movement ceased. The ripples on the deep still held in a suspended, breathless tension. Then, the silence was broken. A voice echoed, not through the air, but through the very substance of the void. It was a command, resonant and absolute, vibrating through the liquid expanse with the force of a physical blow. Let there be light. The sound did not fade. It ignited. At the center of the darkness, a single point of intensity flared. It was not a gradual brightening, but a violent, instantaneous rupture. A blinding, white-hot radiance tore through the velvet cloud, expanding with terrifying speed. It hammered against the deep, turning the stagnant, heavy shadows into brilliant, searing clarity. The light did not merely illuminate, it conquered, pushing back the edges of the void with an unstoppable, searing pressure. Where there had been only the heavy, suffocating weight of nothingness, there was now a brilliant, piercing brilliance that scorched the eyes and defined the space. The darkness recoiled, retreating into the furthest reaches. The radiance continued to burn, but now it began to shift. The light did not remain static. It moved with purpose, gathering itself into a concentrated mass. From the opposite side, the remnants of the darkness responded, drawing back into a dense, heavy cluster. A boundary line formed, a sharp, invisible edge that cut through the expanse. The light and the dark pushed against this divide. The light surged forward, then retreated, while the darkness mirrored the motion, creating a rhythmic pulse that rippled across the void. This was the first oscillation. The light claimed its domain, and the darkness settled into its own. The separation was absolute. Where the light held sway, the space became vibrant and clear. Where the darkness retreated, it became a sanctuary of shadow, cool and still. The light was named day, a time of activity and exposure. The darkness was named night, a time of rest and containment. The universe now possessed a heartbeat, a steady transition that marked the passage of the first day. The cycle locked into place. The rhythm of the first day settled into a steady hum, but the work of creation demanded a new dimension. Below the expanse, the waters remained a singular turbulent mass, heavy and uncontained. They churned in the deep, a vast, shifting ocean, without a ceiling or a floor. Then, a new command resonated through the architecture of the void. A subtle, internal pressure began to manifest within the heart of the liquid. It was a slow, grinding force, like the shifting of tectonic plates, pushing against the weight of the deep. The water rose up in a strain, swirling in chaotic, violent eddies as it resisted the change. Suddenly, the resistance broke. A horizontal fissure tore through the center of the mass, a clean, sharp line of nothingness that began to widen. It was not empty, but a new, crystalline structure taking form. This expanse stretched outward, a vast, invisible barrier that grew with relentless speed. The firmament solidified, a grand arch ceiling that defined the reach of the new world. It was named Heaven, a silent, expansive vault. The vast, submerged world beneath the firmament began to stir with a new, singular intent. The waters, once a uniform and stagnant expanse, felt the pull of a command. They began to surge, not with the aimless motion of the past, but with a directed, heavy momentum. Great, swirling vortices formed across the surface. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight that forced the water to abandon its hold on the hidden foundations below. It was a violent, rapid displacement. The sea level dropped as if drained by a bottomless throat, exposing the slick, dark ridges of the abyss. The water resisted, crashing against the rising obstacles. It gathered into massive, rolling tides, retreating toward the lower basins with a roar that echoed through the empty space. As the final sheets of water slid away, the first jagged, raw surfaces of the foundation revealed. They were slick with brine and dark with silt. The surface of the world was no longer a mirror of the sky, but a broken, emerging landscape. The waters continued to churn and pull, carving out the deep channels. The transition was relentless, a massive geological shift that stripped away the liquid veil to expose the hard, unyielding structure of the world beneath. The landscape now stood exposed, a raw and dripping expanse of stone and silt. The water, once a chaotic master of the surface, had retreated into the lower basins, leaving behind a world of distinct, physical boundaries. It pooled in the deep depressions, the surface tension holding the liquid in place as it stopped its violent surge. The ground was still dark, saturated with the remnants of the deep, but it held its shape against the pull of the gravity that had birthed it. A profound stillness descended upon the terrain. The churning tides had quieted into a rhythmic, lapping motion against the newly formed coastlines. The land was no longer a submerged mystery. It was a defined, solid reality of ridges, plains, and valleys. The water had retreated to its assigned limits, filling the vast, low-lying basins that would hold the weight of the deep forever. The separation was complete. The world possessed a clear anatomy, a duality of solid ground and liquid expanse. There was a sense of finality in the stillness, a structural perfection that waited for the word to define it. The command echoed across the vast, silent horizon, resonant and absolute. The solid ground was named Earth, a firm foundation for all that would follow. The gathered, deep waters were named seas, the vast, shifting reservoirs that would cradle the edges of the world. The geography of the creation was set, a stable, enduring stage carved from the void, ready to receive the life that would soon emerge from its surface. The earth remained silent, a vast expanse of wet, mineral-rich silt and hardened stone. It was stable, yet entirely devoid of movement. Then, the stillness broke. A low, rhythmic pulse began to vibrate through the crust, originating from deep within the soil. The ground, once cold and unyielding, started to radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth. Tiny fissures appeared across the surface, spider webbing through the mud and clay as if the land itself were exhaling. From these cracks, a subtle emerald hue began to bleed into the landscape. It started as a faint, microscopic shimmer, then surged with sudden, undeniable vitality. Tiny, needle-like points of green pushed upward, piercing the crust with persistent, upward force. They were the first sprouts, delicate yet relentless. They did not merely grow, they erupted, unfolding in rapid, synchronized bursts of life. The barren plains, previously defined by the dull tones of wet stone, transformed under a carpet of vibrant, verdant blades. The grass spread with a rhythmic, creeping speed, covering the ridges and filling the valleys. It was a soft, living blanket that softened the harsh edges of the terrain. The carpet of green deepened, shifting from simple blades to a complex, layered tapestry of vegetation. Across the plains, stalks rose with rhythmic precision, thickening as they reached toward the light. Each plant began to manifest its own unique architecture, branching out into intricate patterns of stems and leaves. The transformation was not merely in height, but in the internal complexity of the growth. Small, bulbous nodes formed along the stems, swelling with the pressure of new life. These were the vessels of the future, the containers of potential. Within each pod, seeds matured, hardening into compact, self-contained units of existence. The process was relentless. As the wind swept across the plains, it caught the ripened heads of the herbs, causing them to sway in unison. A sudden, sharp crackle rippled through the fields as the first pods burst open. Thousands of tiny, dormant lives were cast into the air, carried by the currents to land in the soft, waiting soil. Every patch of soil became a nursery. The rhythm of growth accelerated, shifting from the delicate spread of herbs to a sudden, tectonic upheaval. The ground groaned, the soil parting in long, deep fissures, as thick, woody pillars surged upward. These were not mere stalks, but massive, gnarled columns of life that defied the gravity of the plain. They rose with a steady, relentless force, twisting into intricate patterns of bark and branch. The canopy expanded rapidly. Where there had been only flat, green expanse, there was now a vertical architecture of wood and leaf. Small, tight buds appeared. They burst open in a synchronized display, releasing a wave of color that transformed the air into a fragrant, heavy mist. Within moments, the blossoms withered, replaced by the rapid expansion of fruit. The branches sagged under the sudden, heavy weight. The landscape was no longer a simple field. It was a layered, three-dimensional forest. The cycle of life had reached a new height. The focus shifted from the dense terrestrial growth to the vast, empty expanse above. The firmament, previously a uniform veil, began to undergo a profound structural transformation. A subtle, rhythmic vibration hummed through the atmosphere, signaling a change in the fundamental geometry of the heavens. Invisible currents carved out precise, sweeping arcs across the void, establishing the pathways that would soon define the movement of time. The sky stretched, thinning and clarifying until it possessed the depth of an infinite, polished surface. Within this newly prepared expanse, specific zones were demarcated, each designed to hold a distinct celestial body. The firmament was no longer a static dome. It became a complex, interconnected mechanism of orbits and alignments. Every inch of the celestial sphere was measured and calibrated, ensuring that the coming lights would move with absolute, unwavering consistency. The air grew still, the silence deepening as the final preparations were made to anchor the cosmic order. The heavens were now a vast, empty stage. The silence of the firmament shattered. At the heart of the prepared arc, a single point of intensity erupted, expanding with violent, golden speed. It was not a slow burn, but a sudden, total ignition. The sun flared into existence, a massive, roiling sphere of white-hot energy. A wave of raw, unfiltered heat rippled outward, striking the atmosphere and turning the void into a brilliant, blinding expanse. The light poured down, washing over the earth and forcing the shadows to retreat into the deepest crevices of the forests. This was the ruler of the day, a relentless, burning presence. As the sun reached its zenith, the atmosphere began to shift, the golden intensity softening. The sun dipped below the horizon, and in the resulting vacuum of light, a new presence emerged. It rose from the opposite edge, a cool silver disk. The moon did not burn. It glowed with a reflected, steady luminescence that bathed the world in soft gray clarity. The cycle was locked. The fiery heat of the day and the silver stillness of the night now governed the world in an eternal, rhythmic pulse. The silver glow of the moon was merely the beginning of the night's transformation. As the lunar disk traced its slow arc, the remaining darkness of the firmament began to tremble. A single spark ignited near the zenith, followed instantly by another, and then 1,000 more in a cascading, silent explosion of light. The void was no longer empty. It was being claimed by a vast, intricate tapestry. Stars erupted across the expanse, each one a sharp, cold needle of brilliance piercing the velvet black. They did not appear in sequence, but in a sudden, overwhelming surge. The scale of the heavens shifted, pulling the eye upward and outward until the true depth of the universe became visible. These were not mere lights, but distant, burning furnaces scattered in a complex, geometric rhythm that defied the eye. They clustered in dense, shimmering rivers of white, then thinned into isolated, pulsing beacons of blue and gold. The firmament became a deep, infinite ocean of fire. Every corner of the sky was now occupied, a dense, glittering field that stretched into an impossible distance, anchoring the firmament in a permanent state of wonder. Below the vast, shimmering surface of the world, the oceans remained a heavy, silent weight. For ages, the water had been nothing more than a vast, cold volume, shifting only by the pull of the tides. Then, the stillness broke. Deep within the crushing pressure of the abyss, a subtle rhythmic pulse began to resonate. It was not the movement of current or wind, but a deliberate, internal force. The water began to churn, swirling in tight, localized eddies. Tiny, bioluminescent sparks flickered in the blackness, darting through the brine like needles of cold fire. The density of the sea shifted as something new, something sentient, pushed against the currents. The water grew turbulent, foaming at the surface as unseen shapes darted through the depths with sudden, sharp velocity. The sea was no longer merely water. It was a living, breathing expanse, teeming with the first, raw impulses of existence. The turbulence beneath the waves intensified until the surface could no longer contain the pressure. A massive, dark shape surged upward, displacing tons of water in a singular, violent heave. The ocean split open as a colossal whale broke the plain, its immense body rising like a mountain of living muscle. Sunlight caught the slick, dark expanse of its back as it arched high above the foam, shedding sheets of brine that fell like heavy rain. The sound was deafening, a thunderous crack of water hitting water as the creature crashed back into the depths. Before the spray could settle, a second giant followed, its tail fluke slapping the surface with enough force to send ripples racing toward the distant horizon. These were not mere inhabitants of the sea. They were masters of its vast, crushing volume. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly powerful, turning the once still water into a chaotic, churning arena. Each breach revealed the sheer scale of the new rival, a rhythmic cycle of rising and falling that dictated the pulse of the ocean. The air filled with the mist of their exhaled breath. The ocean surface calmed, the heavy spray of the giants settling into a rhythmic, rolling swell. But the silence that followed was short-lived. High above the water, the air itself began to vibrate. A single, sharp snap of wings broke the stillness, followed by another, then a dozen, then hundreds. From the jagged cliffs and the foam of the breaking waves, life erupted into the sky. Thousands of birds took to the air, their wings catching the updrafts in a sudden, frantic display of motion. They rose in swirling, chaotic patterns, their bodies darting through the light like living arrows. The ceiling, once an empty expanse of blue, became a tapestry of movement. The sky had found its masters, and the world echoed with the sound of 1,000 beating hearts. The focus of creation shifted from the open sky to the solid, waiting ground. Beneath the layer of grass and herbs, the soil began to pulse with a new, hidden intensity. Small fissures appeared in the dry earth, widening as life pushed upward through the crust. First came the creeping things, a myriad of small, scurrying forms that emerged from the shadows of the ferns and the damp hollows of the soil. They moved with frantic, purposeful energy, weaving through the roots and over the stones. Then, the plains began to tremble under the weight of larger movements. Cattle rose from the tall grass, their hooves striking the ground with a rhythmic, heavy cadence that echoed across the landscape. They moved in herds, their bodies carving paths through the thickets and clearings. The forests, once silent, filled with the rustle of movement as these new inhabitants claimed the land. Every patch of shade and every sun-drenched meadow became a theater of activity. The air grew heavy with the scent of crushed leaves and the sounds of grazing, a low, constant murmur that replaced the stillness of the wilderness. From the smallest beetle to the largest grazing beast, the earth was no longer a static foundation, but a vibrant, living tapestry. The symphony of life had found its footing, turning the silent plains into a domain of constant, breathing motion. Beyond the open plains, the earth rose into jagged ridges and deep, shadowed ravines. Here, the scale of life shifted once more. From the dense thickets and the rocky crags, the most powerful beasts of the earth emerged. They moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, their presence commanding the very air around them. Massive forms stepped into the sunlight, their muscles rippling with raw, untamed power. As they moved, the ground beneath them seemed to groan, and the smaller life forms scattered, clearing a path for their passage. A low, resonant sound rolled across the valleys, a primal declaration of their arrival. They claimed the high ground and the deep forests, some prowled with silent, lethal precision through the underbrush, while others stood as immovable pillars in the open clearings. The ecosystem locked into place, a vast, intricate machine of instinct and motion. The world was now a fully realized, breathing kingdom. Across the vast expanse of the earth, the frantic pulse of the animal kingdom began to wane. The predators slowed their prowl, the herds ceased their grazing. A profound, heavy stillness descended upon the land, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The wind died down in the canyons, and the rustle of the forest faded into an absolute, expectant silence. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the most massive beast, stood motionless, sensing a shift in the fabric of existence. The cycle of instinct had reached its zenith, yet a void remained. Then, the silence was broken. A voice, resonant and singular, echoed through the void. "Let us make man in our image." The words rippled through the atmosphere, carrying a weight that eclipsed all previous acts of creation. The air seemed to thicken with the gravity of this purpose. The earth, having been filled with life, now waited for the one who would hold dominion. The focus of the Creator narrowed, centering on the dust and the clay, preparing for the most intimate and significant act of all. The Creator moved from the heavens to the quiet, waiting earth. He knelt upon the ground, where the soil was rich and cool. With deliberate, steady hands, he began to gather the dust. It was not a chaotic assembly, but a focused, rhythmic labor. He sifted the earth, separating the coarse from the fine, until the material was ready for the work. Slowly, the clay began to take shape beneath his touch. He molded the frame with an artisan's precision, pressing the earth into the structure of bone and sinew. Each movement was intentional, carving out the curvature of a chest, the length of limbs, and the delicate architecture of a face. The ground yielded to his pressure, transforming from formless dust into a complex, balanced vessel. He smoothed the surface, refining the contours until the figure lay perfectly still upon the soil. The creator stepped back, observing the stillness of the form he had fashioned from the very dust of the ground. The creator leaned low over the silent earthen frame. The air between them grew charged, crackling with a sudden unseen current that set the dust motes dancing in the stillness. He placed his hands near the clay, and the very ground seemed to tremble in anticipation. With a steady, deliberate motion, he bent closer until his face was inches from the clay nostrils. He drew a deep, resonant breath and exhaled, a concentrated stream of vitality pouring directly into the vessel. The effect was instantaneous. The dull, gray clay began to flush with warmth. The chest of the figure heaved, a sharp, ragged intake of air that broke the long silence. The clay skin softened, turning supple and vibrant. Then, the eyelids fluttered. They parted, revealing eyes that caught the light for the very first time. The figure shifted, fingers curling against the soil, legs drawing up as the weight of existence took hold. A low, soft sound escaped his lips, the first sound of a living soul. He blinked, looking up at the sky. Then, at his own hands, his movements uncoordinated but alive. The transformation was complete. The dust had become a man, and the man had become a soul. The man pushed himself upright, his muscles adjusting to the pull of the earth. He took a tentative step, then another, feeling the resistance of the soil beneath his feet. He looked toward the horizon, where the mountains met the sky, and then down at the creatures moving through the tall grass. The creator stood beside him, gesturing toward the breadth of the world. He spoke, and the sound resonated across the plains, defining the order of all things. The man was to be the steward of the land, the guardian of the seas, and the protector of every living creature that moved upon the face of the earth. This was not a gift of ease, but a mandate of purpose. The man turned his gaze to the forest, watching the movement of the beasts, and then to the birds circling in the currents above. He understood the scope of his reach. Every living thing was now under his care. The man moved into the landscape, ready to begin his work. The creator moved to a high vantage point, the ground shifting beneath his feet to offer a clear view of the expanse. He turned his gaze across the breadth of the world. He watched the light filter through the canopy of the forest, illuminating the dew on the leaves. He observed the tides pulling against the shore, a rhythmic pulse that matched the breathing of the earth itself. He tracked the flight of birds as they navigated the currents, and the steady movement of beasts across the plains. Every element was in its place. The balance was absolute. He saw the man standing in the center of the garden, testing the soil, observing the life around him with a steady, watchful eye. There was no discord. No friction remained in the design. The creator traced the lines of the mountains, the flow of the rivers, and the arrangement of the stars. He paused, letting the silence of the completed work settle over the land. He looked at the complexity of the life he had fashioned. From the smallest seed to the man, he weighed the harmony of the whole against the intent of the beginning. The assessment was final. He spoke the words, affirming that the work was very good. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the clouds in deep shades of gold and amber. Across the plains, the intensity of the day began to soften. The beasts of the earth moved toward the shade of the trees, their movement slowing as the heat of the afternoon faded into a cool, steady breeze. Birds ceased their flight, tucking themselves into the dense branches of the forest, while the insects began their rhythmic chorus in the tall grass. The man watched the light retreat, noting how the shadows stretched and merged, drawing a veil of quiet over the land. The water of the seas grew still, reflecting the darkening sky like a polished mirror. Every creature found its place, and the pulse of the world settled into a gentle, rhythmic cadence. There was no urgency, only the profound satisfaction of a cycle brought to its natural conclusion. The vibrant energy of the day was replaced by a serene, expectant calm. As the last sliver of light vanished behind the mountains, the world stood in perfect, silent harmony. The sixth day had reached its end, and the earth rested. The work was finished. Not a single detail remained unformed, not a single space left empty. The heavens stood in their vast arched expanse, anchored by the stars that burned with steady, unwavering light. Below, the earth held its shape, the mountains firm against the sky and the seas contained within their basins. Every host of heaven, the celestial lights, the invisible currents of the air, and every host of earth occupied the space designed for them. It was a structure of infinite complexity, yet it held together with the precision of a single pulse. The atmosphere hummed with the weight of this accomplishment. There was no missing piece, no loose thread. The firmament and the ground were locked in a perfect, eternal alignment. From the highest reach of the heavens to the deepest root of the trees, the vast, formless void had been replaced by a world of absolute, breathtaking order, standing complete in its majesty. The creative impulse, which had surged through the void like a rushing tide, suddenly ceased. The hand that had shaped the mountains and breathed life into the dust withdrew. There was no transition, no slow fade. The work simply stopped. The frantic energy that had defined the previous days evaporated, leaving behind a silence so deep, it felt like the foundation of the world itself. The stars hung fixed in the firmament, their lights steady and unhurried. The winds that had stirred the seas died down to a whisper, then vanished altogether. Even the pulse of the earth seemed to slow, aligning with a new, deliberate cadence of stillness. The man stood in the center of the garden, watching the horizon, sensing that the very air had changed its texture. It was no longer charged with the electricity of formation, but heavy with the weight of profound, unmoving peace. The Creator moved away from the expanse of the heavens, stepping back from the intricate machine of existence. For the first time since the light had pierced the darkness, there was no movement, no command, no change. The universe held its breath. The cycle of labor had reached its absolute limit, and in that vacuum of activity, a deep, resonant calm settled. The seventh day stood apart from the others. It did not possess the rush of the first, nor the structured growth of the middle days. It was a threshold. The Creator turned his gaze upon this specific span of time, lifting it out of the linear progression of the week. He placed a mark of distinction upon it, separating it from the rhythm of labor and the necessity of production. This was not merely an absence of work, but a deliberate act of sanctification. He declared the day holy, weaving a different quality into its fabric. A stillness that invited presence rather than action. The sun rose and set, yet the day remained anchored in this unique, elevated state. It was a space designed for the recognition of the work completed, a mirror held up to the entirety of the creation. By blessing this time, he transformed it into a sanctuary within the calendar, a recurring point where the world could pause. The air of the garden remained undisturbed. The creatures moved with a gentle, unhurried grace, and the man felt the weight of this new, sacred duration. The seventh day was not an ending, but a completion that would echo through every age to follow. It held the weight of all that had been formed, a silent witness to the transition from void to vibrant life. The man walked through the garden, his steps slow and measured, sensing the profound stillness that had settled over the earth. Every leaf, every stone, and every creature existed in a state of perfect alignment with the purpose of its creation. The air carried a clarity that felt ancient and new all at once, a resonance of the divine command that had brought order to the deep. This rest was the final brushstroke on the canvas of existence, a seal of approval that transformed the material world into a sanctuary of meaning. As the horizon deepened with the soft light of evening, the man looked toward the firmament, feeling the vastness of the heavens. The work was finished, and it was very good. A sense of total fulfillment saturated the atmosphere, a quiet, unshakable peace. It was the final, eternal note in the song of creation, a stillness that invited the universe to simply be, held forever in the palm of the divine.